Hi, my name is Stephanie Preston. I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much to the organizers. This important symposium is really exciting. Thanks for your attention to climate change, especially in the context of our science. I'd like to thank the people who funded our research and also the people who participated in our research, including Ting Ting Liu, who's a graduate student, a former PhD student. Brian Vickers is a former PhD student. Logan Bickel in the bottom right was an undergraduate honors thesis student. Rachel Seidler was a collaborator in our fMRI studies. And Russell Noble, Robert Sue, and Ellis Dyke participated in studies as undergraduate honors thesis students. My background is in both cognitive science and neuroethology or behavioral neuroscience. I studied animal behavior and the brain mechanisms of those behaviors in natural behavioral contexts, including monogamous voles, food storing animals, and non-human primates. But I'm interested ultimately in the way that the brain supports our behavior through interactions between emotion and decision making. I think this is a really important topic because, as some of you may know, the United States is the top emitter of carbon emissions, anthropogenic climate change, and especially if you control for per capita, our consumption of resources is very extensive, especially per person. So if we're going to do something about climate change, it really needs to be addressed in America, where I live. People sometimes lack the motivation to do something about climate change, which we're going to talk about today from a cognitive and emotional perspective, because they don't always understand the issue, they can't see it firsthand, they don't always trust the news sources, and they're not really sure what to do about it, which are all things that go against what normally motivates us for action. I use two frameworks that have driven my research for the past decade or two. One is the interdisciplinary science of consumption, and one is the altruistic urge. These are books that you can purchase, but I'll tell you about them today. In the interdisciplinary science of consumption, I think about ways in which the brain evolved from early mammalian evolution to support an interaction between decision making and emotion. For example, we're highly motivated toward things we find rewarding, and we are prevented from acting when we feel uncertain or scared, which is going to be very important in the context of decisions to help the environment. In the altruistic urge, again, I return to mammalian behavior. For example, we know a lot about the neural systems of caregiving. For example, this is what we call pup retrieval, where a rodent can return a helpless pup to the nest. And there's a neural circuit, and Michael Newman has drawn a really interesting circuit here that involves both approach motivation and avoidance motivation. So depending on your level of certainty, the hormones on board, your comfort with the situation, your knowledge about the correct motor response, you're going to be more inclined toward an approach or an avoidance motivation, which can be modulated by cortical connections, for example, with the orbital frontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. This altruistic urge is particularly strong in certain situations when there's a vulnerable target, which is like a neonate, but doesn't have to be a neonate, somebody in distress who immediately needs help. You know the response. It's viable, and you have some expertise in the situation, and you don't feel particularly scared or uncertain, which would potentiate an avoidance response. And this is a particular kind of altruism, a particular kind of helping that doesn't always occur in every situation. It's not about all kinds of altruism, but a kind that's very important for motivating action. Next, I'll describe a bunch of studies we've done in our lab, some fMRI, some behavioral, to examine the ways in which people have these motivations to save things, to act for the environment, to be altruistic in ways that I think are pertinent to this problem. In some studies, we use emotion induction. So you could put people into groups based on inducing anxiety, sadness, or neutral affect. We often use stories that people try to get themselves immersed in. They imagine a story where they have to, for example, go to the doctor for an important medical procedure and they don't know what's going to happen. They have a test that day. They're not sure how they're going to get there on time. Versus sadness, where you have to visit a loved one in the hospital who's really not doing well, versus just getting ready to start your day, controlling for the amount of time the imagery takes, and they're always as clear in the minds of people, but they induce different emotional states. Afterwards, we allow people to acquire objects for a seemingly unrelated task. So we intentionally create items that are worth about the same amount of money, but they have really different attributes. So some are food and some are non-food or goods. And then between the food and the goods, some are just more pleasurable, some are more useful and not as pleasurable, and some are both useful and pleasurable. Because we are interested in whether these emotions can predispose you toward particular kinds of items. For example, maybe sadness makes you, want pleasurable food, or anxiety makes you want useful items, and everybody wants both. Indeed, as we predicted, when people are anxious, they acquire more items total. And we even replicated this in COVID-19 during the peak pandemic, and we could compare some of the exact same items pre and during COVID-19. And people take a lot more items in general during COVID, but they also take more useful items and particularly useful food. So they're more interested in food during the pandemic, and the useful food is relevant during the pandemic because people can use it for a long period of time, like rice and dry beans and the type of stuff that has long shelf storage. That was very high in demand during COVID-19. And we also demonstrated people had a really intense need for things that were specific to the pandemic that we didn't have prior data on, such as toilet paper, and Purell was actually the highest hand sanitizer. So feeling some anxiety promotes people to acquire goods because it makes them feel like they're solving a problem that they're experiencing, whether it's relevant or not, and whether it's in proportion to the problem or not. In another set of studies, we studied people who have tendencies toward hoarding, like they acquire more goods and they have trouble letting go of stuff, more so than the average person. And we were interested to know if this is a kind of impulsiveness, like are they impulsively acquiring things in the way that economists would describe for money and delayed discounting. But it wasn't clear that people would have the same discount rates for money and for stuff. So we tested multiple kinds of items. An example problem would be, would you rather have $5 right now, or would you rather have $10 in a week? So if you're impatient, you'd rather have less money now or sooner. Versus, would you rather have $5 in a year or $10 in a year plus a week? And people are more willing to be patient if they already have to wait. So once you remove the context of immediacy that causes the hyperbolic discounting, then people become more patient, which creates this discount function that you see on the right. But as I said, we tried it for money and a material good, which we use pens, and a food, which we use snacks. And it turns out that the people on the right have higher hoarding tendencies, so they're more likely to acquire too much stuff and have trouble getting rid of it. And these people are actually more patient. So a higher bar means they made more choices for waiting longer to get the higher reward. And the people who are low hoarding, more like a typical person, they had more impatient choices than the people who were hoarders. So that was an interesting domain specific result. But the people who do have hoarding tendencies, in accordance with their description of their behavior, they were much more impatient for goods and snacks. So consumable items fitting with their description, they were more impatient for. And the degree to which they showed this distinction between money and consumables correlates with clinical level hoarding scales. So the HRS and the SIR are scales they use to measure the degree that someone has hoarding tendencies, and they use it during diagnosis. And the OCIR measures hoarding tendencies associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. So these people are not patients, they do not have a clinical disorder, but they still have elevated levels correlated with their impatience for consumable items. We also study the endowment effect, which is a way in which possession heightens our motivation to hold on to things. So as an example, if I gave you this mug, we use this exact mug in some of our studies, and I say, this is your mug now. How much would somebody have to pay you for it? You might say $30. But when we ask the buyers, if you're in a different condition in the experiment, how much are you willing to pay the owner to take the mug from them? Most people would say, about half. So they would say $15 or $20. So this is a classic effect in behavioral economics. A lot of people already know about. We replicated this in an online sample. People wanted more money when they were the seller than when they were the buyer. And because people with hoarding tendencies feel differently about money than stuff, we also had two different ways in which you could ask for the item, giving a lot of compliments or washing dishes for the person. And the effect replicates in all formats. Again, like with the delay discounting, the more you have trouble letting go of stuff in your life, you have higher hoarding tendencies for discarding problems, the more you would have this endowment effect distinction between buyers and sellers. But in accordance with our research on altruism and empathy, if you felt bad for the buyer or the seller in the opposite condition of yours, then you would lower or raise your prices to be more generous. So buyers and sellers both ameliorate their tendencies when the person they're dealing with feels sad or is in some physical pain that they described during the introduction to the experiment. If you have to choose who you most would like to give the mug to in a within subjects version of the study, people would most likely to give the person who's feeling sad the mug. It's like an act of empathy and altruism where you feel bad for the person. And so, you feel like maybe letting them have this mug or letting them have it at a lower price is a way that you can make them feel better, or you don't want to take advantage of them. So, this is evidence that even though people consider the endowment effect sort of inviolate way in which the prospect theory shows in people's behavior, it can be altered, and altruism and empathy are strong motivators to alter this sequence. In another version of a sort of possessiveness or ownership, we had people make decorated pretzels in the lab so that they would feel some ownership over the items, sort of like the IKEA effect described by Michael Norton and colleagues. And as you can guess, some people's pretzels come out better than others. There's, ones that people rate lower on niceness, medium on niceness, and as really high on looking nice. And then in the scanner, we have people see the pretzel and they know if it's theirs or somebody else's, and they know if it's likely to be thrown in the garbage or saved. And then there's a work phase where they can tap as fast as they can to try to keep the item, and then they find out what happened. And indeed, like the endowment effect, people work a lot harder if it's their own pretzel. They think it's nicer. They think it's worth more money. So you get this difference between mine and yours, and it's very robust. In the scanner, when people are tapping as hard as they can to try and save their own pretzels, you get this really strong, robust, mostly motor-related response. But this is actually the masked image that already subtracted out the effect of tapping at the same frequency when there's no pretzel. So this is actually already a masked result. That's not just the result of how much it takes to press the button. Also, when you're looking at your own pretzel and you have a really strong difference between your own and others' items, then you have stronger nucleus accumbens, sort of reward-related activation when you're just looking at your own pretzel. We've also applied this directly to the environmental domain, and we've shown that people want to protect items that they feel some psychological ownership over, which can be a natural area. So this is a study where you imagine that you go on daily walks at this nature area, but you don't own it versus you're a legal owner. And when people just feel psychological ownership, they don't actually own it. They're willing to put in their time to help protect the item and to block exploitation of the item. Whereas legal owners are more likely to block exploitation, but they're not putting in a lot of effort to protect the environment. And similar for paying money to help, you're more likely to pay to protect with psychological ownership, but legal ownership exacerbates also the blocking of exploitation. We also looked at this with charity donations. When people see charities that involve children or infants, they pay a lot more money than when they involve adults in need. They are more likely to donate money when there's a need for some heroic aid in the immediate sense. And they give the most money in this three-way interaction when a neonate needs some immediate nurturance. And in the brain, you see this sort of motor cognitive activation in dorsal ACC and the SMA. And these areas, the red, are also more pronounced in a structural voxel-based morphology of gray matter. So it's both activation and gray matter that are influenced by the degree to which people prefer these particular kinds of targets. I think the earth is an important target in the way people try to motivate action. They say, save the earth, or like, it's our planet, save the planet. But I think these are actually pretty demotivating concepts because in people's minds, from actual content analysis, we find people think of the planet as a big, powerful, timeless, permanent rock that is even there to help us rather than something that might need our help, which is bad for our altruistic motivation. So we showed people all these different ways in which one might think, they do not feel emotional about the destruction of the earth. We'll return to that in a second. And you can alter people's concepts by the way you describe the ad. And people are more likely to donate when they consider it as vulnerable and needing our protection. But the emotion of awe can also be very helpful. This environmental impassivity is an individual difference when people feel less emotional when they see the earth in danger or suffering or damaged. So this is an individual difference measure that we examined in 3 studies. People who feel more impassive about the earth are less concerned about it. They think that God created it for us. They think it's going to be fine, and they less enjoy nature. So they feel less awe and enjoyment being in nature, actually. There are also a lot of differences emotionally in people who are impassive to the environment. They're not psychopathic, but they do have low empathy for other people. They have less expression of emotion. They use suppression of emotion more. They are perfectly fine on concern for future. So it's not like a failure to imagine the trouble in the future. They express less emotion. They're more alexithymic, and they have lower empathy and perspective taking for other people. But it turns out it's not just about the environment. It extends to all of these sort of positive and negative emotional features. So whether it be a person in distress, yucky food, delicious food, even cash money and cute babies and puppies, they just across the board are less emotional. But they're perfectly intact at reading emotion, so it's not that they don't understand emotion. So this is an emo Stroop task where you have incongruous versus congruous faces and words. You're only supposed to pay attention to the words, but people who naturally decode the expression do worse when it's incongruous, and they show that normal effect. We've also been studying conservation directly. We did a study on the monarch butterfly showing that people are really excited about helping monarch butterflies because there's a very concrete action to take to plant milkweed. And also they think that they're beautiful and they have an amazing life story. So there's, again, awe involved and beauty. And we compare people's interest in helping people versus wild animals versus domestic animals, juveniles versus adults. And we find similar themes as in the altruistic urge, where domestic animals can be cute, but wild animals can be beautiful. So they have to be attractive in some way that's specific to the species. But you're more likely to want to help when it's obvious that you think it needs help and it's a familiar species to you. And awe, again, is involved in how powerful it might be, how beautiful or amazing, especially for a wild animal. So what do we know about this? The reason I've been studying hoarding disorder and effects of anxiety and possession is because, Americans are high consumers. And so how can we block this sense of like passionate consumption, which is directly damaging to the environment? I do believe that it's pertinent to know that the brain evolved some sense of self-preservation, which is on people's minds, reward seeking, avoiding discomfort, discounting the future, wanting to be a caregiver, predicting action, being a very astute, immediate capacity of the brain, and being protective and or possessive even when it comes to material goods. So these are all things that can potentially be difficult for pro-environmental action. And that's made worse by an American, at least, or Western culture where you have a lot of life stress that increases focus on yourself, feeling helpless about the context of climate change. Marketing and design make the rewards of consumption really salient and hard to resist. And people are also buying things to compete for status or to fit in. And the solution and the problem are things people can't directly see and don't feel ownership over. So this caregiving and protective response and the action to promote care are really lacking. So I think in a solution, we need to focus people on slower, more natural rewards. Nature exposure and nature appreciation have already been shown to be effective. Focusing on protecting your own loved ones and future generations has been shown to be effective. We want to reduce the stress and the fear of threat or scarcity, which increases consumption and hoarding because people want to take care of their people by accumulating stuff. But we also have to articulate clearly what a problem is, that we're responsible for it, and what the solution is. We can't give vague, big picture statements about the earth that aren't motivating to people. We need nonpartisan solutions because, for example, the impassive people who don't feel particularly concerned about the environment are more likely to be conservative. So emotional pleas for help that are very effective with liberals and environmentalists are not effective in that context. So we need other types of solutions. And we also have to revise social norms so that consumption isn't the way in which we evaluate peers. I think the best way to do it is to focus people on rewards. So, like, imagine a different world where you don't have to work as much because you're not trying to consume as much. You're more tuned into nature and your community and your family, and you can still have a perfectly viable and safe and secure life, but we all have access to the resources we need because we're not focusing on overconsumption and possession of the landscape. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you at the meeting with your questions. Bye bye.